Hello and welcome to Midwest Writers Room. Our mission is to encourage, educate, and celebrate writers of the Midwest. I'm Luella Schmidt.
And I'm Ken Humphrey. Today's chapter break episode features James Francisco Bonilla in his latest publication, An Eye for an Eye, Growing Up with Blindness, Bigotry, and Family Mental Illness. The release date for this book is November 4th, 2025.
James Francisco Bonilla is a New York City born Puerto Rican writer now living just across the Mississippi in Winona, Minnesota. Shout out to Minnesota from Ken and I. He was born with congenital cataracts and has never had sight in his left eye. At age 9, he lost much of his remaining sight in his right eye due to a racial assault. A decade later, a medical breakthrough restored the sight to his right eye. Because of his experiences, his memoir follows his entry into the early disability rights movement, which helped ground his work as a community organizer and later as a nationally recognized social justice educator and environmentalist.
So before I do the synopsis, well, I got to tell you, I'm always a fan of wordplay. And so the title of this book, An Eye for an Eye, right? An eye spelled out like eyeball for an eye, as in first person. If you see where the cover is above my head, I think that's just clever. I always like that.
Great.
So here's a synopsis. After a classmate hurled a horseshoe at his face, James became legally blind. A horseshoe. A horseshoe. Ooh. At home, too, he feared physical violence, experiencing the unpredictable outbursts of a single mother suffering from mental illness. Searching for relief and inspiration, he discovered an unexpected solace in the natural world, spiritual encounters with Mother Earth that led him both towards personal healing and advocacy. An Eye for an Eye presents both James and his aggressors with refreshing nuance and humility, inviting readers to empathize, be inspired, and consider their own potential to be of service in a broken yet beautiful world.
What a lovely synopsis, James. Welcome to Midwest Writers Room. How are you doing today?
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. It's a beautiful day, actually. Nice fall day.
That's right.
Yes, it is. So let's talk a little bit about the book, James. And I kind of want to, do we generally open with, how did this book come about? But with memoirs, that origin story tends to be pretty self-explanatory. So my question then to you is, when did you know your story would actually become a book? Is there a defining moment that you can point to?
Sure. Actually, I was in the process of retiring and I thought, oh, let me try writing. And I was spent about 3 years writing a novel about a Midwest town coming to terms with its diversity. And about 3 years in, I was at a writer's retreat with Mary Carroll Moore, as a matter of fact, on Madeline Island at the Center for the School for the Arts. And, I just realized, it just hit me. My main character, my protagonist, was not working. And part of it was I wrote her as a New York Puerto Rican lesbian, and they say write what you know. Well, that was not a great fit. And Mary Carroll Moore said to me very innocently, well, you should write about your life. It's just an interesting life. And that afternoon, I pretty much filled out the storyboard for the major part of the memoir. What I hadn't done, and this is where when your writers will know, sometimes the muse takes over. And all of a sudden, I started not just talking about being blind and Puerto Rican, but my family's history, and particularly the history with mental health, which eventually also affected me. So that's more or less how it sort of shaped up, not by plan so much, but by just following the voice.
That's actually pretty cool. Did you have writing in your background? I mean, did you do it in any form of occupation or as a hobby before?
Yeah, well, I was a professor at Hamline University in St. Paul, and I had written probably over a dozen chapters or articles. But the thing about academic writing is um, it doesn't really care so much about the audience. And so I had to unlearn. I had to sort of become a recovering academic writer. And that's what the novel taught me, that, I had to think differently about how I wrote. So even though I had done, and published, I had never written anything for a general audience. And that was the big stretch for me. Continues to be a stretch for me.
All right. So the medical breakthrough restored your partial sight at the age of 19. Um, What did that feel like? How did that change your perspective on your disability or your sense of identity? How those things tie in?
Well, so again, have never been able to see out of my left eye, but then I lost the sight in the right eye, and about 10 years passed, and then they came up with this new surgical procedure. And I write about this in the memoir. That night in the hospital, I was like freaking out. I was this close to taking sedatives because I kind of liked who I was, who I had become. I felt like a pretty well-adjusted kind of poster boy for blindness. And I didn't really want to join the masses of the non-disabled. And I was literally freaking out. And then the next morning, when they took the bandages off, my mother had gotten a taxi because she was too nervous to drive. And the taxi driver, when I walked out, the taxi was this psychedelic yellow color that I was like, my God, what is this guy? Was he on acid when he painted this tax? And then I realized everything I was seeing was intense like I had never experienced before. The best metaphor I used in the book was I have a friend who is bisexual, and she said, I was married to a man for many years, and it was like watching a black and white movie. It was perfectly fine. But the first time that I had a female lover, it was like in Technicolor. And that's how I experienced seeing, like we drove through Central Park and everything was just so vivid. It just like I could feel my blood sort of pulsing in my veins because the trees were incredibly red or yellow and people in jogging outfits. And so that was, and the identity part has still, it took years to reformulate that identity, but the experience set the groundwork.
I think it's so beautiful the way that you describe it. I suspect that as human beings, all of us, from the time that we were kids, get used to seeing all of the beauty of the world and get sort of bored by it. But it's still all there for all of us. And you really
Yeah.
got to experience that, like
Yeah.
from, one day to, from 1 minute to the next.
Yeah. Literally. Yeah.
So memoirs in particular often require revisiting a lot of our painful experiences to get them on the page. It helps us process trauma, I think, in some cases. You experienced both racism and ableism from a young age. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you see those struggles intersecting in your life story?
Sure. One of the reasons I started to write the memoir was I said, well, I'm noticing a lot of overlaps between the work I was doing, like, for example, the anti-racism education work and the experiences of disabled people. Um, and we actually pioneered a workshop back in the 80s on the issue of disability and ableism. And, things like stigma, um, which applies to both race, but also there's a stigma that sighted people um, are really quite limited and, can't. The best example I used in the book was when I went to go see a vocational rehabilitation counselor who had never met me before. And he wanted me to take a job selling newspapers at a kiosk on Grand Central Station. And I went with to see him just because I needed his signature so I could apply for scholarships for college. But I mean, and this was a professional in the field at the time who basically thought, well, blind people can only do certain things, tune pianos at the time and work in kiosks selling newspapers. And, kiosks have gone by the way of the dodo. So, you know, noticing how people's expectations were lowered based on your difference, which happened to me as a Puerto Rican kid, but also happened to me as a legally blind kid, was one of the first things that made me start to think, there's something worth investigating here. The difference, I would say, is that unlike being a person of color or around gender, I'm not going to become a white person or white people aren't going to become people of color, but everybody is susceptible and probably will eventually visit being disabled. And that makes for a really interesting opportunity to engage people who otherwise might not, be interested at all, or they would feel like, oh, this is just political correctness. But, a lot of people in the workshops that we initially did around disability came because either they had experienced disability but more often because they had relatives or friends. So there was a relational ability that they had that doesn't always happen with issues around race.
Hmm, interesting. And then you add to that, you also write candidly about, growing up with a mother struggling with mental illness. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you would share a little bit about how that's maybe shaped your own thoughts about trauma and mental illness and generational trauma.
Yeah. Well, I would offer advice to your writer listeners that if you're doing a memoir, get in touch with a good therapist because you want to check in with them regularly. And, it had been years of my doing my own therapy where I started to realize that my mother was not the norm. She had serious mental health issues. And, I started to investigate where those came from. But I also started to realize that her issues impacted me. And it wasn't until I was in college that it really became pretty critical. I mean, I had suicidal thoughts in college, and it I started to see how trauma moves from one generation to the next. And there's some interesting writing going on. Stephanie Fu wrote a book called What the Bones Know, and she's an Asian American, and she talks about how her parents' trauma got translated onto her. And so that became a big learning aha for me.
Yeah, the concept of generational trauma I find absolutely fascinating. I feel like it's the key to unlock so much to help us all as a society to kind of, heal a little bit. It's
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
an exciting
Hmm.
time in that way. So it's an
Hmm.
interesting thing that you're touching on. So how about advice you might have for any young activists out there, especially if they're navigating their own identities around disability or other marginalized groups?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a hard time right now. It's always been a hard time for activists and people who are concerned about social justice. I think we're living through, unfortunately, a particularly difficult period. And my advice would be that, persist, learn resilience, because if you're able to develop resilience, you're able to continue even when it's really stormy. Um, the other thing I would say is, really delve into your identities. And I said identities because it can become a resource for you to draw upon when things seem dire. I know for me, I grew up not knowing much about my Puerto Rican history or my family, and it was really in the process of exploring who these people were and what that meant to me that I realized that my father's godfather, which in Puerto Rico is a big deal, the godfather's really a big deal, was Pedro Albizu Campos. And Pedro Albizu Campos in Puerto Rico was the guy who led the independence movement for decades. And so I started to see, oh, wait a second, this is kind of inbred in me to
That's
to
right.
be up there, right? But I didn't had no idea about that until I started to explore my family's history and that identity. So yeah, that I would say that, some of the work we have to do as activists is really just get to know ourselves and where we come from.
Yeah. For sure. Thank you. Well, all right. We're up to the reading, James. Whenever you're ready, take it away and maybe start by sharing with our listeners where you're going to be reading from
Yeah,
to.
this was a challenging assignment. Thank you for the difficult homework. As a faculty member, I really appreciate good homework, and this was good homework. Um, I ended up going to the afterword because part of what you had asked about was lessons learned, and the most of the book, I'd say about 180 pages, is really about just telling my story and those various journeys that I went on. But towards the end, I start to reflect on uh, what I've come to understand. So that's what I'm going to do is just read a little bit about um, one early insight I had to do with the myth of blindness as tragedy. I don't ever recall feeling my blindness was a catastrophe worthy of pity. Shortly after my surgery, I was asked, "Aren't you glad you got your eyesight back? Isn't it a miracle?" Although it seemed a straightforward question, I didn't have an easy answer because it's a complicated question. Yes, having my eyesight restored was a blessing, but I wanted people to grasp that I was more disabled by my environment and the social discrimination of others than by my physical blindness. Of course, having eyesight makes things accessible to me that weren't accessible when I was legally blind. In Country of the Blind, which I recommend this book highly by Andrew Leland, he quotes Laura Walk. She says, quote, "Blindness is going to impose limits on me that it doesn't impose on a sighted person. In some ways, life would be easier for me if I were sighted. Blindness is at once a non-defining characteristic and a serious disability." I'm going to read that again. Blindness is at once a non-defining characteristic and a serious disability, and I can hold those ideas simultaneously in my mind. End quote. But having been blind also gave me, Jim Bonilla, special entry into a world not often made privy to the sighted. It's useful to remember that I'm just like you, except for a decade I couldn't see very well. When I was legally blind, I was owed no less respect, value, or dignity than that granted to the sighted me today. Leland writes, "The failure to appreciate this basic fact that someone's difference does nothing to alter their humanity is the wellspring of all discrimination." My story is complicated because I wasn't simply legally blind. I was a Latino in an Anglo society that values Latinos. And I lived with mental illness in a society that treats mental illness more as a stigma to be hidden than as a medical condition needing understanding and attention. My blindness, Latino-ness, and mental health story were and are inseparable and all wrapped up into one complex bundle. The image from my Temagami Vision Quest, which I did in Canada, that illustrated this complex relationship best was when people were dancing in the final evening spiral, hand in hand by firelight, pulling and pushing one another towards finding the center of their collective journey. The vision of weaving dancers encapsulates how blindness, Puerto Ricanness, and mental health were woven together in a singular dance that moved me towards finding my spiritual center. As both a community organizer and educator, I've witnessed how, within the larger movement for social justice, disability often gets ignored or pushed to the sidelines. As someone who was both racially and sexually assaulted in my life, I persevered thanks to a host of good people, fortunate events, and Mother Earth who came to my assistance. Yet, a 2009 Department of Justice study found that people with disabilities were 2.5 times as likely to experience violent attacks, including rape and sexual assault, as non-disabled people. In Time magazine, Rebecca Tausig says, this ability expands to every possible corner and intersects with every other identity. Activist Justice Shorter concurs. There is no way to separate my blackness from having a disability. According to Andrew Leland, this generation of disability activists increasingly believe that, quote, disability justice begins from a premise of intersectionality, the idea that the oppressions people experience because of race, sexuality, gender, class, and disability are all linked, inseparable forces that need to be fought together. So I no longer perceive my blindness, Puerto Ricanness, and family's mental health struggles as separate parts of my identity. They are all interwoven into one fabric.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Intersectionality is sort of a new word. I mean, newish, new in the mainstream, I
Newish. Yeah,
guess.
yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Um, do you want to just say a little bit about that word, just for our
Oh man,
listeners?
I'm not an expert on intersectionalities. I'm actually going to be doing a podcast with a woman who is. But what I learned in the process was that, and I think it's human nature. People start out by exploring one facet of their either their family history or their health or you name the gender. I mean, you name the issue. And it's not until later that people start to see the complexities of how that works, how they push and pull each other. And an example I can give is that when I went to New York City public schools, 80% of the Puerto Rican kids never graduated. Now, that had a lot to do with low expectations by teachers. But because I became legally blind, I was able to get special assistance in the classroom. And so there was an example of one part of my identity would have held me back. And yet the other part of my identity helped sort of move me forward. So, examining how complex this phenomena is and where they, interact with each other is, I think, really worthwhile, particularly. And I do think this is something that the younger generation of activists are much more clued into than my generation was. That they're much more willing to say, yeah, I'm not just this thing, I'm this thing, and I'm this thing, and when I was that age, it was like, that's too much. And they seem to have a better handle. I appreciate that about them.
Yeah, I feel like when we were younger, it was the goal was to just be like everybody else as much as possible, to
Yeah,
try to
yeah,
conform
sure.
as much
Yeah,
as possible rather than
exactly.
talk about and enjoy our differences, I
Right.
guess. I don't know.
There's a passage in the book where I talk about realizing my mother had mental health issues and how I didn't want anybody to know because I figured, it's tough enough being legally blind and being Puerto Rican. I don't want to deal, and I didn't have the word at the time, but the stigma of mental illness. And I turned down a very high-paying job when I graduated from college working at a state institution for people with mental illness because I was so afraid. And I thought I had so bought into that stereotype that I had wanted nothing to do with it. So.
Hmm. So tell our listeners where they can find more about you and where they can find your book.
Well, as you mentioned, it comes out November 4th. It seems like it's forever, and now it's right on us. Um, if you want to get the book, you can pre-order still. If you go to the U of M website, there's a coupon, and you can get like 30% off, which is cool. But the book will come out November 4th. It'll be available through the U of M Press website, but you can also get it after November 4th through Google or Barnes and Noble.
All right. And, we're recording this episode on October 9th, so we're still a few weeks out from the actual publication date. But do you have any appearances or signings on the docket?
I got a few, yeah. And I want to give kudos to the University of Minnesota Press folks because it's been I've known a lot of people who've self-published, and I'm so thankful for all the stuff that they do, including helping. They've organized a launch party for the book at Next Chapter Books in St. Paul on Thursday, November 6th from 6 to 8 p.m. And there'll be wine, so I want to invite your listeners to come to that. Or if that's too far away, if they just want to come across the river on Thursday, November 13th, we're having a launch party here in Winona at the Blue Heron Cafe from 5 to 7. And there won't be wine there, but there will be appetizers, and they make fabulous food at the Blue Heron. So, and the last thing I would say is that on Saturday, December 6th, I'm going to be in Wisconsin at Pearl Street Books in La Crosse. They're going to be having a table, and I'll be there from 10:30 to about noon, meeting folks, signing books if they want to buy them. Um, so those are the major appearances so far.
All right. I'm not much of a wine drinker, so I'll just drag my bottle of bourbon into one of these things and
Oh,
pop.
that's fine. Or you can come to Blue Heron and have some great food. So, and you can buy your own, bourbon there if you want.
All right. Perfect. So I want to take this time now to thank James Francisco Bonilla, Jim to his friends, which I hope he now counts the Midwest Writers Room as, for taking time to introduce everybody out there to his book, An Eye for an Eye. Thanks to everyone for hanging out with us in the Midwest Writers Room. I'm Ken Humphrey.
And I'm Luella Schmidt. Words ignite imaginations and spark change. Never underestimate the power of storytelling.
Midwest Writers Room is a production of the Wisconsin Writers Association. Writing and editing by Luella Schmidt and Ken Humphrey. Sound design and editing by Ken Humphrey. Music for the Midwest Writers Room was written by Michael Ramir C. For more information, please visit wiwrite.org/podcast. Thank you.